for that brilliant introduction, David Bolt, and it's such an honor from you, who really lit a fire under disability studies a decade ago with your idea to start a little journal that's now been picked up internationally and pulled together people from disparate parts of the globe who were involved in local and even national ways working on disability issues, and also across disability, but to pull them together into an English language journal that nonetheless works with translations. JLCDS is just a boon to the field and to all of us who teach it. Today we're going to present our work towards Pedagogy and T4. And we want to start just with some meandering reflections on Holocaust Studies today, 75 years out from Auschwitz. I should begin by saying that I am heavily influenced by the work of my cousin Timothy Snyder, who wrote Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, and my other cousin, Marcy Shore, who wrote Taste of Ashes, and they're at Yale. That's his 5th book on the Holocaust. He began by really opening the door on the Polish Holocaust. So we can go fairly geopolitical with this session in terms of talking about impairment, historical years, locations of devastation and of empire and of reconciliation, and the grand illusion, as Tony Jude puts it, of the European Union, as well as the North American role in it, and our disparate colonies, as we all are. And Dave and I live down the street from the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and it really is the best museum in Washington, D.C., and we welcome all of you to come and visit us. It's very accessible. T4 is tacked on there for different reasons of funding and because of its experiment of beginning a Holocaust museum in North America with immigrants. And we hope that T4 will be more built into the idea of the Holocaust Museum that's to be founded and started in London, and that keeps being talked about on the news, and so I think that it has good momentum here. And what else? I mean, we've been going to Germany and studying T4 first with a DAD, Deutsche American Academic Exchange faculty grant that funded visitors to the T4 sites and interacted with German scholars. Also, we've had German disability studies scholars, undergraduates and graduates seek us out. I mean, even 20 years ago, Anya Tereboren, who's now at the Free University in Berlin and is now tenured in education, was studying disability pedagogy at Northern Michigan University, of all places. And I think that there's a host network. Rebecca Mascos, who is a wheelchair user, studying with David and myself at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the network's extensive. We're going to go through that. Okay.
Thanks so much to everybody for coming. Last session of the conference, one can tell the significance of a conference by how many people are left at the last session. So I think that your presence here is a testimony to that. I wanted to also start with my own thanks to David and the group that have put together this conference. They're so necessary for disability studies so that we can all get together. And some of the people that are here are people I've known since the early 1990s. And this is the only place I get to see them. So that's an incredible pleasure.
How remarkable.
And I think Laura, Claire, David, Pipa, all of the people who put in so much work to these things are massive amounts of work, as everybody knows, but such an incredible testimony to the power of the research center here. I think anybody who works in a department that has other people working in one's field realizes how incredibly valuable that is, because you need that professionalism, that collegiality, that kind of everyday ability to bounce ideas off of each other, and it's incredibly evident in this research center itself. So I want to start by acknowledging that, ask everybody maybe to join me in thanking them for putting this on. David had mentioned our new book that will be out in a couple of weeks called Biopolitics of Disability. The cover art is something that Sharon and I devised that we called Vitruvian Man with Seaweed. And when I went to my hotel before coming here, the card of the hotel was Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. So there's some very strange serendipity in doing that. And the thing that one of the things that struck me about the conference is the continuity of people's arguments. I'm thinking of Julie's here, Dan's talk, Rod, Tanya's, about the issues of the limits of our current concept of inclusion. And that's very much what's at the heart of the biopolitics of disability, which takes a concept of neoliberal inclusion, argues it's too narrow and small if the concept of inclusion for disabled people is to merely get to live like able-bodied people do. And so the heart of the book is very much about what difference disability makes, as Rod once beautifully put it in I think one of the great books of the field in and of itself. And it was Rod's talk yesterday also that made me think about the fact that he was arguing, in some ways we've only devoted ourselves to the question of showing up. And I think that's so true, so wonderfully colloquial in the way that Rod puts things. And we really haven't started the work in many ways of saying what difference will it make? How will we show up differently? And then Peter had a beautiful line that he quoted in his keynote today about what difference does it make if we have survivors' perspectives, if survivors' perspectives are nothing more than the same as non-survivors' perspectives. And so Sharon and I have been very much committed to trying to pull that out. And that's very much at the heart of the biopolitics of disability. I think it's very, very similar to the idea that Dan and his colleagues are working on too, around dishumanism and the questions of the post-human. So I look forward to kind of that conversation coming up. This particular talk, though, is, as Sharon had said before, something we've been working on for a number of years. And before I alarm anybody about how long this will go, what I want to say is really we have one major purpose, which is to show a short film that our students made at the end of the spring semester of 2015, which involves studying the T4 program and the history of the mass murder of disabled people in Nazi Germany, and then going to Germany and visiting the sites itself. This is something Sharon and I have done several times, and we did it with a couple of the scholars in this room who were incredibly fortunate to kind of open up this significant archive of historical material, because our argument has been that one can't quite understand the Holocaust unless one understands the traffic in international eugenics and concepts of degraded bodies that inform the Holocaust, but it has largely been left out of Holocaust studies. So in some ways this class was very much an effort to take up that question and think about it in an active way. So let me begin just quickly. An overview of what I want to discuss today. Avoidance of the subject of disability. This is, David's work has been so influential on us. And the last conference was that we attended was called the Avoidance of Disability. And I wanted to bring that up because it seems to me very necessary for what we've been talking about here in this conference centered around education, and also why I wanted to come and talk about the kind of pedagogical undertaking that we think the study of T4 can engage students in. So, avoidance of the subject of disability mass murder in Germany during World War II is longstanding in Holocaust studies and public education pedagogy. This talk will explore how a recent undergraduate course for the Dean's Scholars in Globalization program expands existing understandings of disability history as central to teaching from an international point of view. Without a tangible comprehension of global eugenics, there's no adequate way to educate students about how practices of disability exclusion serve to fuel Nazi ideologies and technologies of mass death. At the conclusion, I'm going to end by showing you this short film our students made about it. But one caution, this talk is not going to be about T4 per se. I really want to talk about the memorialization effort in Germany that's taking place around the question of T4, which has taken more than 70 years to develop, despite the fact that I think Germany, unlike most nations, has dealt in a very kind of visceral, open way with the tragic history of the Nazi regime. So, in other words, I want to think a little bit about the contradiction of a nation that so openly memorializes and tries to record its mandatory in German public education for all students to take a course on the Holocaust, for instance. And you have to go visit a concentration camp at some point in your public education experience. And I find that very remarkable, that a nation tries to so openly deal with the question of its own traumatic, violent history. And I think that's going on in Germany. And why T4 has been so reluctantly absorbed into that question, although it has now in many ways, and that's also what I want to talk about. For instance, last September, the T4 Memorial opened up. First time that Berlin has included the T4 program in its memorialization effort. And it was part of our opportunity to bring our students to look at that memorial and think about it in an active way. Compare it with the American Holocaust Museum that Sharon mentioned before, and then think about the wider act of memorialization and what it entails. What is the relationship of our present situation with respect to people with disabilities living in Germany and this historical past, the knowledge of it? So, what I have on screen here, and I'm going to try to describe this so I don't increase the levels of exclusion that this presentation will depend upon, which is a PowerPoint slideshow and then a film. All I can say is, yes, I've learned my lesson. But I haven't done it. So the T4 website depicted on the screen here, it's called eugenics.t4. And it's curated by a German disability historian. His name is Robert Parser. It reflects on the expanding body of materials now available on the contemporary memorialization and research of medical mass murder in Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1946. And I like using 1946 because it throws anybody who knows the history of World War II off, which presumably ended in 1945, but the disability killings continued for almost another year beyond the formal end of the war. I came upon the digital memorial website while co-teaching an undergraduate class titled Disabled People in the Holocaust with my partner Sharon Snyder this semester in the English department at George Washington University. The class introduced students to a body of scholarship about the T4 program from the late 1970s to the present. So in part, the class was about the history of T4 itself, what happened, who was involved, how it came about. But it was also about the development of the scholarship about T4, how it unfolded over time, particularly over the last 30 years or so. In other words, we followed the chronology of the development of the history of scholarship as a living entity that shifts and changes over time. We began by reading publications on Action T4 by the German author Ernst Klee, without whom none of this material would exist. He was really the first person to unearth this. And Klee was a kind of popular sociologist, conservative journalist. In fact, he's not particularly well respected even now in Holocaust Studies. And the American medical historiographer of Nazi physicians, Robert J. Lifton. Some of you may know Lifton's work. And we used that as a primary text, read the entire thing, talked to our students about the kind of psychology of Nazi physicians, a very important part of the class. So both Klee and Lifton began unearthing the elaborate system of deception implemented by National Socialist eugenicists to systematically destroy disabled German people in psychiatric institutions at the opening of World War II. And the fact that T4 happened on disabled German people is very important, because it's the reason why the mass medical murders were not tried as part of the Nuremberg trials. And we're all too familiar now with war crimes trials. War crimes trials are largely about acts of violence you commit against the people who are not your own. And so the Nuremberg trials separated off the disability murders by arguing that because this was German citizens, they should not be tried in a war crimes tribunal, and they were left to the German legal system to prosecute. And I think that's important to know. This slide right here is from the campus of the Brandenburg Psychiatric Institution, where there's something called the Psychiatry Museum. But the Brandenburg Psychiatric Institution is a functioning psychiatric hospital. And that's the case in almost all of the buildings and structures and memorial sites we're going to talk about today. And as part of what our students took up and started to try to think about very actively, what does it mean to have an operating psychiatric hospital on the site of medical mass murder from T4? So the memorials are ensconced within these operating institutions. This is the back of a building at Brandenburg. And the building was the place where hundreds of disabled people were sterilized. And to understand the history of T4 in Germany, one has to understand that in 1933, when Hitler came to power, the first public policy that the Nazi government passed was the sterilization law. The sterilization law resulted in 400,000 disabled people being sterilized by the beginning of World War II. And then effectively, that same number of people being executed within psychiatric institutions. In other words, there was a mass sterilization program and then a mass murder program. Not only did this research contribute, Klee and Lipton, to the foundations of understanding laid by Holocaust Studies, it also helped to make more explicit the links between the T4 program and the mass murder of Jewish and Sinti people within and without the borders of Germany. New research exposed the contours of Nazi medicine as it rapidly turned from a commitment to healing individual bodies into a population-level extermination program. Rather than a commitment to heal the individual Nazi physicians turned toward healing the people. And thus, those who could not be rehabilitated or cured were identified as cancerous cells among the people. And I think that understanding is really key. It was the way that we helped our students understand why the T4 program happened and occurred. This movement from a kind of individual healing to a population healing, and thus in the way that one might amputate a limb in order to save the life of an individual, Nazi physicians argued that one had to amputate the population of disabled people in Germany itself in order to improve the health of the wider population itself. And we focused and spent a lot of time in that thesis and talked about it. This next slide is a picture of Petra Fuchs, who's a professor in Germany, helped to create the T4 Memorial. This is our group at the T4 Memorial site itself, and you'll see the memorial in the film. Many of the patients selected for death had already been sterilized following the passage of the 1933 sterilization law that served as one of the first state-implemented policies of Hitler's government. Those chosen for death by a committee of 40 Action T4 experts were based on reviews of superficial summary medical data supplied on mandatory registration forms by doctors, nurses, and social workers to the Central Administrative Office located at the Tiergartenstrasse No. 4 building in Berlin. The site is now occupied by a memorial exhibit commemorating the T4 murders where the office once stood. The memorial was imagined by a committee of disability professionals and advocates that included the disability studies scholar Petra Fuchs and two other cognitively disabled citizens who, as Petra tells it, were utterly marginalized during the process. So this committee came together. It shared a goal of coming up with a memorial to the T4 program. There were 3 disabled people included in the committee. Petra was the only one who had any authority, probably because of her status as a professor. at a university, the disabled citizen participants, their perspectives were completely discounted during the process of the creation of the memorial. Despite Germany's open public commemorations of those killed in the Holocaust and its own state-sponsored tragic history, it has taken more than 70 years to include medical mass murder in its national conversation. Specifically, the second generation T4 research that we studied increasingly exposed how medicine practiced at the level of the body politic, rather than on behalf of individuals with medical conditions, could serve as justification for murder as a benign medical intervention, one that relieved individuals, families, and the nation at large of a biological and economic burden. The killing program realized its deadly ends through the voluntary participation of psychiatrists, neurologists, surgeons, general practitioners, nurses, and medical staff. The only significant resistance to the program was expressed as a concern with the lack of a formal law that would keep professional participants free from criminal and civil litigation for participating in the mass killings. That was the only medical resistance to the idea. This next slide is titled Perna Sonnenstein. It's a picture of some little cobblestones with different colored crosses painted on them. And in Perna Sonnenstein, Sonnenstein was a psychiatric institution that we visited. These crosses go out from the entry to the gas chamber all the way through town because so many disabled people, almost 20,000 disabled people were killed in the Sonnenstein gas chamber, and there's a cross for each victim. And the interesting thing about this community arts project, which is really what it was, is that because it's paint on cobblestone, you have to actively repaint the crosses every year. So it's a kind of active effort of commemoration and memorialization that has to be maintained by the community. For instance, at Perna Sonnenstein, 100 physicians witnessed gassings of patients as preparation for their future work in T4, and only 2 elected not to participate. This was despite the fact that participation was not mandatory, and one could refuse without retribution by Nazi officials. You were allowed to walk out. The Nazis only wanted active, zealous participants in the program. T4 researchers have forwarded publications on the means by which the Nazis systematically corrupted the medical profession through the promotion of eugenics ideologies developed in the United States and other industrialized Western countries. And this has very much been the center of the work that Sharon and I have done on the scholarship around T4, which is to imagine Germany as a too hermetically sealed, carefully contained space of disability mass murder, and instead talk about the international collaboration that took place in order for it to happen, to open up German activities to a wider international global sphere. Hitler and other lead administrators openly worried over the fact that Germany was behind in the implementation of state-authorized restrictions on disabled people's public support. The research focus on the contamination of medicine can be recognized in titles that have come out since the publication of Klee and Lifton, such as Benno Mueller-Hill's Murderous Medicine, Michael Burley's Death and Deliverance, Action T4 by Gazzali, Cleansing the Fatherland by Christian Cross, and The Origins of Nazi Genocide by Henry Friedlander. And Friedlander's title is most significant, I think, in this group, in the sense that it just says its thesis, The Origins of Nazi Genocide, and that's what's been resisted in particular in Holocaust studies, that one led to the other, that you couldn't have had, the second Holocaust wouldn't have occurred without this first psychiatric institution Holocaust occurring, and I think Friedlander was kind of most brave in taking that on. He took huge heat for it. There was a lot of critique of him, but that argument now holds, I think, and that's partially what the class discussed. All of these researchers share a belief that the mass murder of psychiatric patients laid the groundwork for the later implementation of the final solution, promoted by Himmler at the Wannsee Conference, held in January 1942, and in the film you'll see the Wannsee Conference House where that took place. By that time, psychiatric exterminations were gradually coming to an end. This phase of gassings is known as the killing pause, and the mass killing technology, as well as many T4 staff in psychiatric institutions, were transferred directly to the death camps outside of Germany's borders, such as Auschwitz, Chelmno, and Treblinka. So that process of following those peoples, all of that technology, the crematory ovens, out to the death camps, is the literal space, it's like Darwin's evolutionary gap. It's the place where we set up all of our research and investigation in order to understand how there was a direct link between one and the other. At the halfway point of the semester, students visited Germany for 10 days and entered the terrain of killing centers as a visceral physical immersion into the topic of their studies. The trip included visits to 3 memorials located at the key killing centers of Brandenburg, Bernburg, and Sonnenstein-Pirna. The other 3 centers were too far to visit, but we studied them as well, Lodemark, Ravenneck, and Hartheim Castle. In addition to investigating the history of the killing centers, students also visited memorials to murdered Jews, homosexuals, Sinti, and disabled people dispersed at key sites around the city of Berlin. So we tried to make this a very kind of inclusive, diverse encounter with the tragic history. Not an effort to overwrite the history that existed, but an effort to try to understand what the relationship that exists between them is, and how commemorating one needs to be an inclusive project in and of itself. A further field trip involved a visit to the former concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, where inmates were worked to death, shot in the neck on measuring scales as part of a fake medical examination process. So in other words, that medical examination that was in the psychiatric institution that led directly to gas chambers went with people in the staff as well. It was always practiced, the Holocaust as well as psychiatric murders, under the guise of a medical oversight of the human body. And gassed in an experimental gas chamber that was intended to modernize mass killing practices in more efficient ways for the future. That was what Germany thought its contribution to the world was going to be. Like the T4 Memorial website, we actively pursued a desire to understand the stories of those victimized in the T4 program, including the wild second phase of decentralized killings at hospitals across Germany. So the formal gassings of disabled people stopped by order of Hitler because there was so much outcry in the public in those particular 6 city centers where the gassings were taking place. But it only stopped in kind of in a formal rhetorical expression. The program itself kind of expanded after that, and people were killed by lethal injections, starvation diets, other kinds of death-dealing practices. Our studies led us to the Killing Center memorials with specific questions that sought to destabilize the tour content regarding disabled people. And one of the things that Julie mentioned in her keynote yesterday was the need to teach with an idea of destabilizing the existing information. And so we set up the course not only to learn the existing information, but to say, what can we learn from this material? What can we not learn? Let's take those questions to Germany with us and ask them of the people who are doing these memorial tours. In other words, we went not just as visitors, but as active shapers of the knowledge base. Our questions were as much about memorialization as a practice and regarded the long aftermath of reparation refusals on the part of the German government. For instance, at each memorial site, we addressed questions about the lack of criminal prosecution for those who participated in the killing program. And this is a very sordid and complex history in and of itself, but most of the physicians that oversaw the mass killings of psychiatric institutions were never prosecuted. Some of them were tried to bring to trial. They all claimed mental incompetence or health problems as the reason why they couldn't undergo a trial. And those arguments were largely accepted, and the criminal prosecutions were abandoned.
And the nurses were all following orders. Yeah.
The relative lack of knowledge about where victims' remains from crematoria were disposed of, we pursued that question actively. It was one of the things that when we went earlier in the 2000s with our academic scholars, we couldn't answer, and now I think a lot of the memorial sites know what happened to those ashes. For instance, at Pirna Sonnenstein, they were thrown over the hill in the back of the building. At Bernburg, they were placed in a football field, something that's now a football field, in just a big hole. And that knowledge, I think, is incredibly important. So some of those sites have been turned into kind of memorial sites themselves, and others have been left unexcavated. and how the memorial projects began at each of the killing centers visited. The information we uncovered proved critical to our growing understanding of medical mass murder. And this slide up top, it's labeled Bernberg, and it's a picture of the hallway leading down to the gas chamber with a bunch of pipes up in the ceiling. For instance, at Bernberg, we spoke with the director, Uta Hoffman, who told us how her mother, who worked as a nurse at the psychiatric hospital during reunification after the fall of the Berlin Wall, showed her the gas chamber when she was 14 years old. Later, Hoffman was charged with the obligation, so she brought her daughter down, she showed her the gas chamber, told her about it. Her daughter, as you'll see in the film, said she couldn't believe it. And then her mother sent her to the university to get a history degree, and then brought her back to be the director of the Memorial Center. It's an incredible story. So later, Hoffman was charged by her mother and this committee her mother was on with the obligation of overseeing the opening of the memorial in 1989, and she continues as the director to this day. It was also at Bernberg where we learned of the disposal of human ash from the crematory ovens under a football field, uncovered by a review of psychiatric hospital payments to a man who transported ash in a horse-drawn wagon to a public dumping site in 1941 and 1942. So the way this information has been uncovered is really an incredible story in and of itself about how research and this multidisciplinary effort to understand this process helped to kind of excavate pieces of the information that had been lost. Similarly, at Sonnenstein, we learned of crematory ash being dumped over a hill above the town of Pirna, behind the T4 building at Sonnenstein Institution. Archaeological work in the 1990s uncovered personal relics like perfume bottles, buttons, frozen Charlotte dolls, combs, and charred leg braces during the exhumation. These items are displayed in an artistic glass case hung from the ceiling of the room that once housed crematory chimney number 2. Those crematory chimneys were moved to Dachau. At Brandenburg, we were told of the disappearance of a white spray-painted graffiti on a brick wall that asked the haunting question, do you know what happened here in the summer of 1942? The next slide I'm putting up is one of the disabled writer Penny Fries and our class and people we were talking to in Germany while we visited. All of this information served to nuance our understanding of the overlaps and differences between T4 killing centers and the conduct of their deadly operations. Some were located in isolate castles with dungeon-like basements, such as that Sonnenstein and Breivik, while others were located in the center of thriving cities, such as in Bernberg and Brandenburg. In all cases, the killing centers pursued their murderous work in full knowledge of the local residents. Children were reported to call the Gekrath charity transport buses that carried the patients to their doom, the death buses, as their windows were painted dark gray so no one could see inside or outside. For our group, there was a primary importance placed on making connections between the past and present with regard to disabled people's lives and the utilization of the T4 memorial sites. Thus, our visit to Germany included a reading by the disabled author Penny Fries and discussions with German scholars and students studying the T4 program in Germany. At each memorial, we asked of our guides if current medical staff were trained about the T4 program and whether or not patients were allowed to visit the center. These were our upstart questions, and we asked them at all over the memorial. To learn of a history that might have well included individuals such as themselves now being treated at the same facility. All of the existing memorials claim ties to hosting training programs for medical and educational purposes. So they've all kind of expanded. They're bringing people in, hospital personnel, psychiatric institutions, and school children, and they've become this kind of major educational enterprise. It's really quite incredible how it transformed over the course of a little more than 20 years. The exposure of the history of medical mass murder to patients was more haphazard. At Bernberg, for instance, we were told of patients who were addicted to drugs and happened to wander into the memorial site when their appointments were postponed or delayed. Dr. Hauer, one of the lead tour guides and T4 historians at the Brandenburg Psychiatric Hospital, and Psychiatry Museum argued that prisoners in the psychiatric penitentiary on campus were often brought over to learn about the history of medical mass murder. Likewise, the T4 Memorial Center at Brandenburg has connections with local universities who bring medical students in training to the memorial site itself. In other words, the memorials are slowly emerging as active education centers rather than as reluctant memorializers of a barbaric past long gone, which I think is how they've been treated previously. Due to the relatively decentralized locations of the killing centers in less frequented parts of the country, the memorial sites are difficult to visit, and one must see them as a consciously planned effort. Thus, the T4 Memorial website that Parser, for instance, maintains helps to use a digital humanities format to make the remoteness of the locations more available to those interested in understanding and studying the mass medical murders of World War II. This, in turn, allows ourselves as teachers and students to study the history that is so central to understanding disability marginalization in our own contemporary moment. And in this class, one of the things we did was we made very few specific demands of the students in terms of work they had to produce during the course. In some ways, I think these sections are understood as the work is in traveling internationally, getting to understand and visit international places that they've never visited before. And the class, I think, because the experience had been so powerful and moving, the students produced this massive amount of work. The class wrote a 50-page blog. They made this movie I'm going to show you. These are students who are first year, second year, third year, fourth year undergraduate students at George Washington University. And so we wanted to bring you some of their work and show you what happened as a result.
Should we turn the lights down? Oh, off we go.
This is very short, it's 8.5 minutes long.
Class is how it's not trying to change the definition of the Holocaust, but maybe expand it. I didn't know about Operation, T4 or the entire eugenics program in America and then Germany, and then the euthanasia program that kind of spawned from that.
This complete area was the sanatorium of Globalization until 1939. So it was a really big area here. But for the killing facility, they didn't need that much space because the patients were killed in the same day. So they just needed this small place here, not more.
Sonnenstein, because most of the things were uprooted in a sense. There were no pipelines or gas cylinders. It was just a room. But the thing that I remembered from Sonnenstein was when I entered the last room and it had the personal possessions of the victims. And I just remember looking at these two necklaces, and I love wearing necklaces as well. And at that moment, I was just thinking of how these people were stripped of their individuality, of their rights.
The director of the institution, Henry Pavlovich, was the director since 1928. But he had also no problem to give the patients to the hospital here.
But I could not imagine being a patient there and knowing the history of that. It would be completely unsettling to me to know that I'm being treated in a place that was the site of, the discrimination of a group of people that I belong to.
If you were in Berlin, the only place that you would stumble upon would be the T4 Memorial. And if you didn't actually walk up to the T4 Memorial, you wouldn't know that it was about disability at all.
There was a group, I was part of it, and we tried to realize this information here. And you see, it is very small, yeah? And of course, if you have an exhibition, you need photos, visual materials, yeah? And it should be for everyone, information for everyone, also for people who don't know anything about this. Usually they want to think and so this is the result.
T4 Memorial is a wall of blue glass, and the blue glass is supposed to signify sky, kind of clarity, our relationship of present to the past, so we see a continuity and a connection. In front of the glass is an exhibit that details how the T4 program developed, started, who oversaw it, 70 years to come to an open public recognition of the mass murder of disabled people in psychiatric institutions.
We went with Pedagogics, who, as well as being a fairly famous disability scholar, was highly involved in designing and building it. She was talking about how they just had a lot less funding than the other memorials. I think it's sadly representative of disabilities, access and service. People just don't know that much about disability scholarship, don't know that much about ableism, don't, unless they are disabled themselves, don't think about accessibility.
What we see here is only a huge scandal, no catastrophe. Most people are quite silent in chapter 4. And then they revive when they learn at the very end, oh, these men have never been sentenced, oh, then they show strong anger, and all the anger comes too late, because the crimes are already over. The first group, when the exhibition was really opened in 2010, teach it to me. It was a group of quite smart German students. But after some time I asked them, please, could you explain to me what does this term mean? Caused by parents and DNA and then I asked them, did they know the time that DNA exists? They did not. But the problem is, it was still believed by many people. There are the many sayings about parents and children, and the most popular saying in German language is, the apple falls not far away from the tree. And it's not science, it's not really science.
Meine Mutter hat hier gearbeitet in der Verwaltung im Krankenhaus und sie hat zu denen gehört.
My mother worked in the office, and when you work in the office, you also know what else is going on in the hospital.
Und die Verwaltung kennt ja alles. Und sie ist
One day she brought me down
und hat mir das gezeigt.
and showed me the gas chamber, explaining what it was.
Ich habe zuerst gedacht, meine Mutter macht einen
I wasn't
Scherz.
sure whether I could
Aber es
believe
war
it
kein
or not.
Scherz, es war sehr ernst.
Another thing that surprised me too about all these places is that so many of them had towns and houses nearby, and the tour guides always say that the people could smell the burning, could smell the scent of burning bodies coming from the chimneys, and didn't do anything. And that's crazy. That's crazy that people knew, people could smell it, people could see it.
The library at the Wisconsin Conference House was probably my favorite thing I've seen on this trip. How we organize things says a lot about our priorities as people and our priorities as communities and as nations and worlds.
From a classroom perspective, I realize that literature will never do it justice. Will never do an atrocity like the T4 program justice. I thought it did. It was enough for me at the time. I would read it and I'd be moved by it, but that was it.
Between 1939 and 1945, 300,000 disabled people were killed in the psychiatric hospitals of the T4 killing centers. The staff, as well as the technology of mass murder, were transferred to the death camps of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jewish, Roma, Sinti, and gay people were killed. Participants. Explain the sadness that's fallen on my breast. An old fable haunts me and will not let me rest. Where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings. That's from Heinrich Heinze, Jewish journalist, essayist, and poet, 1797 to 1856. That was the project our students produced for the team. How they tried to explain why what they did mattered. And I think how the T4 program is still a kind of very open question. And that part of what they found revelatory was that they got to participate in the conversation itself. That it wasn't just learning information, repetition, rehearsal, repeat, that there's an active scholarship underway, and by going to these memorial sites, thinking about the question of the history as well as the practice of memorialization, they got to find out things that hasn't not been published in the literature that they could actively turn into their own research and writing about the project. So, at any rate, we wanted to come and share that with you.
And it wasn't really the conclusion of the class. I'll say that we went during spring break, so very dedicated. It was cold. And then the rest of the term talked about the role of the Holocaust in modernity, studied the work of Zygmunt Bauman, Klaus Spittelite's Male Fantasies, Bent, the play by Martin Sherman, we've been to Sachsenhausen and to the LGBTQ memorial sites. We had begun with the reader, but we were well done with the reader, which is the first week of the term. Very much lean.
Thank you, and we'll just open it to comments.